I need to admit something about my job. For 12 years, I've designed bridges meant to outlast the people who build them, trained to treat any structure that needs replacing every few years as a design that simply failed. I work in bridge materials engineering in Seattle, mostly steel and post-tensioned concrete spans meant to function with minimal maintenance for 50, 75, sometimes 100 years, and my entire professional instinct runs in one direction. Durability means permanence, and permanence is the actual goal, the thing every design decision is ultimately in service of. I've sat through more value engineering meetings than I can count where the entire conversation was, at bottom, about how to make something need replacing later rather than sooner. I've built a career on believing that a structure requiring frequent rebuilding is, almost by definition, a structure that failed at the one job a bridge is actually supposed to do. And I've written that exact sentiment into more than one client report without ever once questioning whether it was actually true in every case. Then my colleague Yuki called me, entirely out of nowhere on a quiet Tuesday evening. Yuki Hamada works in heritage conservation engineering in Tokushima Prefecture, on the island of Shikoku, and we met years ago at an international symposium on traditional building techniques, one of those conferences where I usually sit quietly through the sessions on vernacular architecture, waiting for the material science talks to start, more out of habit than genuine disinterest. She called on a weeknight, sounding more animated than her usual careful technical tone, and asked if I could come see something her team had been documenting for the better part of 2 years. A suspension bridge in a remote mountain valley that Japan has deliberately rebuilt from scratch, by hand, every 3 years, for longer than anyone has kept a precise written count. I asked her, honestly, why anyone would design something to need replacing that often when more durable materials have existed for well over a century now. A question I asked half expecting a simple answer about cost or access to modern supplies rather than anything resembling a deliberate design philosophy. She told me, in the tone of someone who has been waiting for exactly that question, that the bridge isn't failing every 3 years. It's succeeding, on a completely different definition of success than the one my entire field operates on, and she wanted me to watch the next rebuild happen in person before I decided whether I believed her, rather than accepting her explanation secondhand over the phone. I sat with that thought for a full day before I actually did anything about it. I booked a flight 2 weeks later. I told my firm I was attending an international materials conservation exchange, which was technically true, and left out how confidently skeptical I still was about the idea that anything built to be torn apart and remade every 3 years could possibly represent good engineering rather than a quaint tradition being kept alive mostly out of sentiment. On the long flight across the Pacific, I found myself sketching out, on the back of an in-flight napkin of my own, a rough comparison of a typical steel bridge's maintenance schedule against what little I already knew about the Kazurabashis, trying and failing to make the numbers land anywhere close to comparable. I had spent 12 years assuming that the entire point of engineering a structure well was to make rebuilding it unnecessary for as long as humanly possible. I did not yet understand how completely that assumption was about to be challenged, or how much of my own professional identity had been quietly built on top of it without my ever really examining it directly, the way most people rarely examine the assumptions their entire careers happen to rest on until something forces the question. The Aya Valley meets you as genuine remoteness, a steep, forested gorge deep in the mountains of Shikoku that stayed difficult to reach well into the modern era. Narrow roads switchbacking along cliff faces above a river running a startling, clear green far below. Yuki picked me up from the nearest train station that morning and drove us the rest of the way herself, narrating the landscape with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has spent years working in a place she still genuinely loves. Pointing out small waterfalls and terraced fields cut into slopes so steep I couldn't quite believe anyone had ever successfully farmed them. She told me the valley has long been associated with the Heike clan, defeated warriors who are said to have fled here after a catastrophic loss in a 12th century civil war, retreating into terrain so difficult to access that pursuit became impractical. Some accounts claiming the vine bridges themselves were built specifically so they could be cut down quickly to sever pursuit entirely. Whether or not that specific origin story is literally true, the valley's historic isolation is not in dispute. This is a place where, for centuries, the only way across certain stretches of the gorge was exactly the kind of bridge Yuki had flown me across an ocean to see, and where 13 such bridges reportedly once crossed the valley's various ravines, only a handful surviving into the present day. We reached the bridge itself in the early afternoon, after a final short walk down from the parking area, and I understood within about 30 seconds why photographs hadn't fully prepared me for it. The Kazurabashi stretches roughly 45 meters across the Aya River, suspended about 14 meters above water, clear enough to see individual stones on the riverbed from the deck. It's woven entirely from thick, twisted vine, wide gaps between the wooden foot slats giving a clear, slightly vertiginous view straight down to the water with every step. Tourists ahead of us pausing at each gap to test their nerve before continuing. Modern steel cables run hidden within the vine structure now, a safety concession made sometime in the 20th century. But the bridge's entire visible surface, the part your hands and feet actually interact with, is still genuinely, functionally vine, roughly 5 to 6 tons of it, harvested from the surrounding forest using a specific hardy species, locals call Shirakuchi Kazura, hardy kiwi vine, chosen for a combination of flexibility and tensile strength that centuries of practical experience identified long before anyone formally tested it in a materials lab. I was wrong about something, standing at the entrance to that bridge working up the nerve to cross it. I'd assumed, walking in, that a structure built from vine would necessarily feel flimsy, provisional, obviously inferior to anything built from modern materials. It didn't. It felt alive in a way steel never does, shifting slightly underfoot with each step, creaking in a register that somehow read as sturdy rather than alarming. The kind of structural feedback a rigid modern bridge deliberately engineers away, and that this one, by contrast, seemed to treat as useful information rather than a flaw to be eliminated. That evening, over dinner in the small town near the valley's entrance, Yuki finally walked me through the actual engineering logic behind the 3-year rebuilding cycle, the conversation I'd flown across the world specifically to have, sketching a rough timeline on a napkin with the quiet confidence of someone who had clearly explained this exact concept to skeptical engineers before. Vine, unlike steel or treated timber, degrades in a fairly predictable, well-understood way under constant exposure to moisture, sun, and the mechanical stress of foot traffic and its own weight. Left in place indefinitely, the bridge's structural vine would eventually weaken past a safe threshold, and the failure mode for a degrading vine structure is potentially far less predictable and far less gradual than the failure mode for degrading steel, which typically gives visible warning signs, rust, cracking, deflection, well before it becomes genuinely dangerous. Rather than trying to engineer around that unpredictability with denser vine, more reinforcement, or a fundamentally different material that would compromise the bridge's traditional character entirely, the valley's approach solves the problem from the opposite direction. Replace the vine on a fixed schedule conservative enough that the structure is never actually operating anywhere near its true failure point. Discarding material that likely still has meaningful strength left in it, specifically to guarantee an enormous, well-understood margin of safety at every single point in the cycle. Yuki told me the 3-year interval itself wasn't arbitrary either. It reflected generations of accumulated observation about exactly how this specific vine species degrades under this specific valley's climate. A locally calibrated constant nobody had needed a formal materials science department to derive. I was wrong about something specific. Sitting at that table, I'd assumed that a 3-year replacement cycle represented, at best, an acceptable trade-off Japan had made in order to preserve a beloved cultural tradition, despite its practical limitations, heritage winning out over pure engineering logic. What Yuki was actually describing was a system where the short lifespan wasn't a limitation being tolerated. It was the safety mechanism itself, deliberately chosen, precisely calibrated, and honestly probably more conservative in its actual safety margin than most of the permanent steel structures I design, which typically operate for decades, approaching the edges of their design tolerances as materials fatigue in ways that are well understood in aggregate but not always precisely predictable for any single structure. My field treats frequent replacement as an admission of failure. The Kazurabashi treats frequent replacement as the entire strategy, executed with a level of quiet, generations-deep confidence that made my own field's obsession with permanence feel, for the first time in 12 years, like it might be solving for the wrong variable entirely. The day everything actually came into sharp, immediate focus happened 3 days into my visit, when Yuki brought me to observe the tail end of that year's rebuilding cycle already underway. A community effort involving specialized local craftsmen, forestry workers who harvest and prepare the vine, and a rotating group of volunteers who assist with the physically demanding work of weaving and installing the new structure over a period of roughly a week. The team's lead craftsman that year was a man named Kenzo Tanaka, who has overseen multiple rebuilding cycles across nearly 4 decades of involvement with the bridge, inheriting both the technical knowledge and a specific, hard-won intuition for vine quality from his own mentor decades earlier, a man Kenzo still referred to formally even years after his passing. I met him on what should have been a routine day of final weaving work. 3 days before the bridge was scheduled to reopen to the public on a date set months in advance, coordinated with the town's tourism calendar and a small community ceremony marking the completion of that cycle's rebuild, banners already printed and a modest crowd of local officials already expected. Kenzo was working through a fresh coil of vine that morning when I watched his expression shift, subtly but unmistakably, from routine focus into something closer to concern. He ran the vine through his hands slowly, testing its flex and resistance against a standard built from decades of doing exactly this motion with exactly this material, pausing longer than usual over one particular section before setting it aside and picking up the next coil to compare. He told Yuki, who translated quietly for me, that this particular batch, harvested from a section of forest the team didn't usually rely on as heavily this late in the season, felt meaningfully weaker than it should, not visibly damaged, not obviously unusable to an untrained eye. I looked at it myself, and it looked, to me, exactly like every other coil stacked nearby, but wrong, in a way his hands had learned to recognize across a career. In a way, no formal specification sheet for Shikoku Kazura vine actually existed to confirm or deny. He had a decision in front of him with no comfortable version. Continue using the batch as planned, trusting that his concern was overly cautious and that the vine, while perhaps somewhat below its usual quality, still fell within the wide safety margin the whole 3-year cycle was already built around, allowing the bridge to reopen exactly on schedule as the town and its visitors were expecting, or halt work on that section, send a team back into the forest for an emergency supplemental harvest of vine from a different, more reliable stand, and risk missing the ceremonial reopening date entirely, an outcome that would disappoint a town that had organized part of its calendar around it and that had never, in living memory, needed to be postponed for this specific reason. I watched him work through it with a small group of the senior weavers, running several more sections of the same batch through their hands, comparing texture and flex against vine from an earlier, trusted harvest laid out beside it for direct comparison. Serious conversation in Japanese that Yuki summarized for me only in fragments, focused more on watching their faces and hands than on translating every word. There was no instrument on site that could give them a precise, objective measurement of the specific quality difference they were all feeling. There was only decades of collective, embodied expertise, several sets of hands independently arriving at the same uneasy conclusion about the same coil of vine. Kenzo made the call to halt work on that section and send 2 team members back into the forest that same afternoon for a targeted supplemental harvest, accepting the real, immediate risk of missing the scheduled reopening in exchange for not compromising the specific, conservative safety margin the entire multi-generational system depended on. He told Yuki, and Yuki told me, that the town's tourism office would need to be informed that afternoon of a possible short delay. A conversation he was clearly not looking forward to having, given how many years it had been since the last time anyone on his team had needed to have it. I watched him make the phone call from the edge of the work site, his voice calm and apologetic, and understood, even without following the Japanese, exactly what kind of conversation it was by the specific way his shoulders dropped once it ended. I was wrong about something specific, watching that decision unfold. I'd assumed, walking into that morning, that a tradition this old and this repeated would have long since become close to automatic, a set of fixed motions executed the same way every single cycle without much room for individual judgment. What I actually watched was closer to the opposite, a genuinely live, high-stakes decision made by a person willing to absorb real social and logistical cost, rather than quietly proceed with material his own trained judgment told him wasn't good enough, protecting a safety margin that existed specifically so that a single bad harvest on a single ordinary Tuesday wouldn't be allowed to quietly erode it. The supplemental harvest came back 2 days later, strong enough by every measure the team applied to it, and the weaving resumed on schedule to finish just in time. The reopening ceremony ended up delayed by only a single day, a genuinely minor disruption in the end, absorbed by the tourism office with what Yuki described as good-natured, if slightly frazzled, flexibility. Nobody treated the whole episode as a crisis, successfully averted, Kenzo. When I spoke with him again once the bridge had reopened, seemed to regard the entire sequence as simply what the job actually requires every few cycles, a version of the same judgment call his own mentor had almost certainly made at some point decades earlier, passed down not as a written protocol but as an inherited willingness to trust your hands over the calendar when the two disagreed. Once the bridge had reopened and the immediate tension of that week had passed, Yuki had several more days planned before my flight home, and she used them, deliberately, to show me how far this same underlying principle durability achieved through honest, deliberate cycles rather than an attempt at permanence extended across the rest of the country. We flew south to Yakushima Island, off the coast of Kagoshima, where an ancient temperate forest covers roughly 11,000 hectares of steep, moss-covered mountain terrain. Some of the cedar trees here documented to be well over 1,000 years old, their trunks wrapped in more than 600 distinct species of moss, thriving in the island's near-constant rainfall, the whole forest floor soft and saturated underfoot in a way that made every step feel slightly muffled. We hiked past one massive dead cedar, its hollow trunk wide enough to hold dozens of people, the decayed interior forming an almost perfectly heart-shaped cavity that stopped every hiker on the trail for a photograph, myself included, despite having told myself beforehand that I wasn't going to be the kind of tourist who did that. Yuki told me the island maintains a genuinely unusual ecological balance. Roughly 20,000 human residents living alongside comparable populations of both deer and macaque monkeys, 3 species sharing the same limited landscape in a rough equilibrium that conservationists actively monitor rather than simply assume will hold on its own, adjusting management practices whenever the numbers start to drift meaningfully out of balance. Standing in that forest, looking at cedars that had been alive for longer than most nations currently existing on Earth, I thought about how differently this particular kind of permanence worked compared to the bridge. These trees hadn't been rebuilt on any cycle at all. They had simply, patiently, continued, a genuinely different strategy for enduring than the one Kenzo's team practiced a few days earlier, equally valid, entirely dependent on circumstances that happened to favor slow, uninterrupted growth rather than periodic renewal. We traveled north afterward to witness the Naruto whirlpools, A genuinely dramatic tidal phenomenon formed where two large bodies of water collide through a narrow strait between Shikoku and Awaji Island, the resulting whirlpools reaching diameters of up to 20 meters during the strongest tidal exchanges. We watched from a walkway suspended nearly 45 meters above the strait. Glass panels set into sections of the floor so you could look straight down at the churning water beneath your own feet. The sensation genuinely disorienting for the first minute or two. The water below churned and twisted in patterns that shifted every few minutes as the tide continued its cycle. Much faster kind of renewal than anything happening in the Iya Valley. This system rebuilding and dissolving itself completely roughly twice a day, driven by forces that will keep doing so indefinitely without a single person needing to intervene, harvest anything, or make a single judgment call about quality. Further north, we took a ferry to Sado Island, 4 times the size of Singapore, once one of the most significant gold mining sites in Japanese history, its underground tunnel network stretching across a genuinely staggering total length once you account for every excavated passage. Generations of miners working by hand through terrain that must have felt, Yuki said, close to endless from the inside. Terraced rice fields on the island's slopes descend directly toward the coastline, their reflected light shifting from silver to gold depending on the season and the angle of the sun, and in the calm bay near one small fishing settlement, we watched a fisherman navigate a traditional round wooden tugboat called a tarai bune, a design specifically suited to maneuvering through the rocky, kelp-choked shallows where a conventional hull would struggle, the boat spinning and adjusting with small, precise oar strokes that looked, at first glance, almost comically inefficient and turned out, watching longer, to be exactly the opposite. Another example, Yuki pointed out, of a solution shaped entirely around the specific conditions of one particular stretch of coastline rather than a generic design imported from somewhere else and simply made to work regardless of fit. We flew to the Japan Alps after that, to Kamikochi, a highland valley surrounded by peaks rising well above 9,000 feet. Private vehicles banned entirely from the valley floor to preserve its ecosystem, a turquoise river running through it with a clarity and color that looked, in person, almost too vivid to be unedited. Closer to something out of a travel poster than an actual place I was standing in. Dead trees stood in the shallows of one calm lake within the valley. Their bare trunks reflected in water, still enough to double them perfectly. An eerie, quietly beautiful effect, Yuki said, had drawn photographers here for generations, several of them set up with tripods along the shoreline, even on the overcast afternoon we visited. We walked for hours without encountering a single motor vehicle, just hikers, the sound of the river, and mountains that felt, standing among them, genuinely separate from anything happening in the rest of the country. A silence that took me most of the first hour to actually settle into after a week of trains and highways. On the way back toward Tokyo, we stopped in Omori, in Shimane Prefecture, the historic center of the Iwami Ginzan silver mine, which at its height, in the 16th century, is estimated to have produced something close to a third of the entire world's silver output, an almost unbelievable figure for a mining district most people outside Japan have never heard of. The town itself has preserved its historic merchant houses and samurai residences along a narrow street with every modern power line buried underground specifically to preserve the visual character of the original streetscape. Motor vehicles banned from the core area entirely, the whole town quiet enough that our footsteps on the pavement felt unusually loud. Yuki told me local residents themselves take direct responsibility for maintaining many of the historic structures, a genuinely different conservation model than the more institutional, government-managed approach common in many other heritage sites, treating the town less as a static museum piece and more as a place people still actively choose to keep living inside, on its own historic terms, repainting a wall or repairing a roof tile the same way anyone maintains an ordinary home, just under considerably more careful guidelines. Near the end of the trip, we visited Kurobe Gorge, in Toyama Prefecture, Japan's deepest and steepest V-shaped valley, traveled by a narrow-gauge scenic railway running in open-air carriages along cliffs of hard granite, bright red iron bridges crossing turquoise water far below, in sharp visual contrast against the gray stone surrounding them, the small trolley car rattling along a route that felt, at several points, close enough to the cliff edge to make me instinctively grip the seat in front of me. During flood season, Yuki told me, the river's flow rate here can reach a volume nearly 3 times that of Niagara Falls, an almost impossible-sounding figure for a gorge this narrow, evidence of just how much water this specific stretch of mountain terrain is capable of channeling under the right conditions, a fact that made the calm, moderate flow we actually saw that day feel almost misleadingly gentle. On my last full day, Yuki showed me photographs of Aogashima, a remote double volcano island south of Tokyo that neither of us had time to actually reach on this trip, accessible only by a small helicopter or an unreliable boat crossing, given the island's lack of any natural harbor, a place she'd visited once herself years earlier and still spoke about with the specific fondness people reserve for trips they know they're unlikely to repeat. A village sits inside the outer crater itself. A smaller, still active cone rising from the crater floor, geothermal steam vents nearby used to slow cook a distinctive local salt through a process locals have maintained for generations, the entire operation running on nothing more complicated than the heat the island itself keeps producing. Yuki mentioned, almost as an aside, that the island's dramatic caldera landscape had partly inspired the setting for a well-known animated film a few years back. One small, striking piece of this remote, difficult to reach place quietly finding its way into the imagination of millions of people who will likely never actually stand there themselves, a strange kind of quiet fame for a place so few can physically visit. I flew home 2 days later. Yuki stayed. Obviously her work is there, in a way that made far more sense to me having spent a week standing inside its actual subject matter than it ever had from a conference hallway. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, usually circling back, in one form or another, to some version of the same unresolved question neither of us has fully answered. How many of the structures I designed for permanence are actually just deferring a version of the same honest renewal the Kazurabashi practices openly, except pushed far enough into the future that nobody currently working on the project will be the one who has to manage it? She emailed me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in Seattle with an update from Kenzo. The supplemental harvest that had delayed the reopening by a single day had held up well through its first heavy rains of the season, showing exactly the strength and flexibility the original, questionable batch had been missing. Kenzo had apparently mentioned, in a conversation with the town's tourism office afterward, that he didn't consider the delay a failure of that year's cycle so much as proof the system was working exactly as it was supposed to, catching a problem before it became load-bearing rather than after. Yuki also mentioned that the town had started, at Kenzo's quiet suggestion, keeping a slightly more detailed written record of exactly which forest sections produced weaker vine and under what conditions, less a formal specification than a shared memory the whole team could draw on the next time somebody's hands told them something a chart couldn't yet confirm. I don't think the lesson I took from that trip is really about bridges, not only. It's about how easily my own field had treated permanent as a synonym for successful, without asking seriously enough whether a shorter, more honest, more carefully managed cycle might sometimes represent the more genuinely safe choice, not a compromise forced on a culture without access to better materials. The Kazurabashi isn't primitive. It's a system that solved the problem of material degradation by refusing to let any single structure approach the edges of its own uncertainty, discarding capacity most engineers would consider wasteful specifically to keep an enormous, deliberate margin between everyday use and actual failure. I've started, since coming home, presenting maintenance cycle options to clients with a little more honesty about what low maintenance actually trades away, rather than treating it as an unambiguous selling point in every single case. What stays with me most isn't the age of the cedars or the size of the whirlpools, honestly. It's the image of Kenzo running that vine through his hands, trusting a form of knowledge no spec sheet could fully replace, and choosing to absorb real, immediate cost, rather than let a single questionable batch quietly slip through a system that has protected people for centuries, specifically by refusing to let exactly that kind of quiet compromise happen. I think about how much of what actually keeps a structure safe, whether it's built from vine or steel, depends on someone willing to trust a genuine concern over a fixed schedule, even when trusting that concern is inconvenient for absolutely everyone involved. I think, too, about how many of my own projects have quietly optimized for the version of safety that's easiest to schedule around, rather than the version that actually requires someone to notice something wrong on an ordinary Tuesday and say so out loud. A short, quiet breath before I let you go. If this story changed how you think about what built to last actually means, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Maybe it's the vine in Kenzo's hands. Maybe it's the whirlpools rebuilding themselves twice a day without anyone's permission. I keep circling back to both, usually while reviewing a maintenance schedule that used to look a lot more final to me than it does now. Because somewhere in a valley in Shikoku right now, a bridge that has never once been allowed to grow old is standing exactly where it always has, waiting for the next 3 years to quietly begin the same honest argument with its own materials all over again. How many of the things we call permanent are actually just being renewed on a cycle too slow or too well hidden for us to ever notice it happening? A slower, quieter version of exactly what Kenzo's team does out loud in public once every 3 years for anyone willing to watch? This narrative is told through the perspective of Naomi Foster, a fictional bridge materials engineer based in Seattle, Washington, and includes the fictional composite characters Yuki Hamada and Kenzo Tanaka. The historical, cultural, and engineering details of Japan described here, including the Kazurabashi Vine Bridge's triennial rebuilding cycle in the Iya Valley, the ecology of Yakushima, the Naruto whirlpools, the Iwami Ginzan silver mine, and Aogushima's partial inspiration for a well-known animated film are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific vine quality concern and rebuilding delay described in this script are a fictionalized composite drawn loosely from the general kind of judgment calls experienced craftsmen managing traditional rebuilding cycles are trained to make, rather than a documented real event tied to any specific year or crew.